The first snow of winter swept across the Montana plains without mercy, driven by a wind that howled like a living thing. It cut through fabric, skin, and resolve alike. Eleanor Hayes stood near the edge of an open field, her back pressed against the trunk of a lone cottonwood, as if the tree itself might shield her from what was coming. It didn't. Cold gnawed through her thin dress and worn shawl, sinking into her bones. Her gloved hands trembled as they clutched the handle of a battered carpet bag, the last object tying her to a life that had vanished almost overnight. Inside it lay everything she owned now, which wasn't much. 3 days earlier, Eleanor had been someone. A schoolteacher. Respected. Needed. Not wealthy, but stable. That life ended in a cramped meeting at a general store, where grim faces and lowered eyes delivered the verdict. Funding had been cut. The territory couldn't afford education through winter. Her position was gone, and with it the small rented room she called home. Now, at 25, she stood alone beneath a darkening sky with nowhere left to turn. The wind shifted, sharper, heavier. Snowflakes began to fall in earnest, thick, wet, and relentless. Eleanor's fingers brushed the 3 silver dollars hidden in her coat pocket. Every cent she had left. Not enough to travel east. Not that there was anywhere to return to. Her family farm in Ohio had been sold off years ago to settle debts. And the man she once expected to marry had made his opinion clear. A jobless schoolteacher was no longer suitable company. The storm was worsening fast. Eleanor had heard the stories, travelers lost, found months later frozen where they'd fallen. That thought tightened her chest with a fear deeper than hunger. Through the growing curtain of snow, iron gates slowly came into view. Caldwell Ranch. Everyone in Bitter Creek knew the name. The largest spread for miles. Endless cattle. Solid land. A house built like it was meant to last generations. Eleanor had seen Thomas Caldwell only a handful of times in town. A broad-shouldered man with a quiet presence and eyes as pale as winter sky. Polite, distant, untouchable. She'd also heard the whispers. A wife lost during childbirth. 2 young sons. A household run by a man alone. Plenty of opinions, very little help. Eleanor didn't consciously decide to walk toward the gates. Her feet simply moved. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps freezing beneath a tree felt like too small an ending for a life that had once held promise. The gates stood open, unusual for a ranch of such stature. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way up the long drive. The house emerged from the storm like something unreal. Warm light glowing from the windows, smoke curling from the chimney. It looked safe. Whole. Everything she was not. She stopped short of the porch, snow settling on her shoulders, unsure whether to knock or turn back. The front door opened. Thomas Caldwell stepped outside, filling the doorway like part of the house itself. No coat, just solid presence. Surprise crossed his face when he saw her standing there, small against the storm. "You lost?" he called out, his voice steady and calm despite the wind. Eleanor swallowed. "The storm came fast," she replied. True, though not complete. He studied her carefully, her thin clothing, the bag in her hands, the exhaustion she could no longer hide. His gaze missed nothing. "You're the schoolteacher," he said, not asking. "I was," she answered quietly. The position was eliminated. He nodded once, as if confirming something he already suspected. "Storm's turning bad. You got somewhere to be." The question struck harder than the cold. She hesitated, then shook her head. Snow fell thicker between them. Finally, he glanced toward the sky. "I've got coffee on the stove," he said. "House is warm. This kind of weather kills people." It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. Just fact. Eleanor hesitated only a second before following him toward the porch, knowing pride had no place left in her life. Eleanor followed Thomas toward the glow spilling from the ranch house windows, the snow falling harder now, swallowing her footprints almost as soon as she made them. The porch offered blessed shelter from the wind, and when the front door opened, warmth rushed over her like a benediction. Inside, the house was far grander than anything she had known. Wide wooden floors, a sweeping staircase, tall windows. But what struck her most was what was missing. No flowers, no lace, no signs of a woman's presence. Everything was clean, orderly, and impersonal, like a place built for work rather than living. "Boys," Thomas called. "Come say hello." 2 children appeared from the hallway. The older one, sharp-eyed and guarded, studied her as if weighing a threat. The younger stepped forward without hesitation. "Are you really a teacher?" the small one asked. "I was," Eleanor said gently, lowering herself to his height. "I'm Samuel," he announced proudly. Thomas gestured to the other. "Daniel." The boys were sent back to supper, and Eleanor was led into a vast kitchen warmed by a heavy iron stove. Thomas poured her a cup of strong coffee, and she wrapped her hands around it, letting the heat seep back into her fingers. The storm worsened quickly. By morning, Thomas said, the roads would be buried. Leaving wouldn't be an option. It was there, over cooling coffee and the sound of wind battering the windows, that Thomas made his proposal. Direct, unembellished, almost blunt. He needed a wife in name and function, not romance. Someone to manage the household, care for the boys, bring order to a home that had lost its center. In return, he offered safety, stability, and shelter from a winter that could easily kill her. Eleanor was stunned by his honesty. There were no promises of affection, only mutual need laid bare. Separate rooms, separate lives, a partnership built on survival. She asked for time. That night, she lay awake in a small guest room listening to the storm rage, knowing that the decision was already pressing in around her. By morning, the world outside was transformed, buried under feet of snow, silent and impassable. Over breakfast, they spoke again. Eleanor asked questions. What would he expect of her? Of the boys? Of their future? Thomas answered plainly. He wanted consistency for his children. Dependability. Someone who would not leave when things became difficult. When Samuel asked if she would stay, Eleanor saw the hope in his eyes and the guarded fear in Daniel's. By the time the preacher arrived days later, the decision had been made. The ceremony was brief and uncomfortable, witnessed by a neighbor and two restless boys. There was no romance, no celebration, only vows spoken carefully and a restrained, formal kiss to seal the agreement. Eleanor became Mrs. Caldwell that afternoon. She was shown upstairs to a bedroom that had once belonged to Thomas's late wife, a room filled with quiet elegance and long-held absence. That night, she unpacked her few belongings beside dresses that spoke of a very different woman and a very different life. The days that followed were cautious and deliberate. Eleanor learned the boys' habits, soothed their quarrels, and read to them in the evenings. Samuel attached himself to her quickly. Daniel watched, waited, tested. Thomas worked the ranch as always, but the house began to change, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Meals were shared. Voices filled empty rooms. A routine began to form. It was not love, not yet, but it was something solid enough to stand against the winter. The tension Eleanor felt at church did not fade when they returned home. It followed her like a shadow, settling into the quiet spaces of the ranch and whispering doubts she tried hard to ignore. The women of Bitter Creek had made one thing clear. Margaret Caldwell had not merely been a wife or a mother. She had been an institution, and Eleanor, whether she wished it or not, was expected to become her reflection. That evening, Eleanor moved through the house with a restless energy. She prepared supper, helped Samuel with his letters, corrected Daniel's careful handwriting, and listened as Thomas spoke of cattle prices and fence repairs. Outwardly, everything appeared settled. Inwardly, she felt as though she were standing on uncertain ground. Later, after the boys were asleep, Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the lamplight flickering across the wood. The words spoken at church replayed in her mind, not cruel enough to be openly challenged, but sharp enough to wound. Thomas entered quietly, setting his coat aside. "They gave you a hard time today," he said. Eleanor looked up, surprised. "You noticed?" "It's a small town," he replied, "and they're protective of their memories." "I don't want to replace her," Eleanor said softly. "I never did. But I don't know how to live up to someone who's been turned into legend." Thomas was silent for a moment. Then, "Margaret wouldn't have wanted that." Eleanor searched his face. "Are you sure?" "She hated being put on a pedestal," he said. "She believed people should be useful, not admired." That stayed with Eleanor long after he left the room. The next morning, instead of letting the unease settle, Eleanor acted. She cleared one of the unused upstairs rooms and arranged benches and a long table. By midday, two neighboring children arrived hesitantly at the door, sent by parents who were curious more than convinced. Eleanor welcomed them in, chalk in hand, voice steady. By the end of the week, the room was full. It wasn't a formal school, just lessons, reading, sums, and stories, but the children learned quickly. Word spread. So did opinions. Some women softened. Others watched closely, waiting for her to fail. Daniel observed everything. He noticed how Eleanor rose early, how she never complained when the stove smoked or the boys argued, how she spoke of Margaret with respect rather than competition. One evening, as Eleanor corrected his spelling, he said quietly, "Mama would have liked you." The words stayed with her. Not all tests came gently. A sudden illness struck one of the neighboring families, and when no one stepped forward, Eleanor went, bringing soup, sitting through the night, doing what needed doing. The same women who had once whispered now nodded to her in town, cautious but no longer cold. Eleanor understood then. She didn't need to become Margaret Caldwell. She needed to become indispensable in her own way. The ranch moved into a new rhythm. The boys laughed more. The house felt warmer. And though Thomas remained reserved, his trust showed itself in small things. Keys left on the table, decisions shared without question, silence that felt less like distance and more like understanding. Winter was far from over, but Eleanor no longer felt like she was merely surviving it. The pressure Eleanor felt did not come all at once. It crept in through polite smiles and carefully chosen words. At the end of the day, Eleanor said calmly, "Every person brings something different to a community." Mrs. Henderson nodded, her smile thin and sharp. Naturally, though the Caldwell family has always been known for contributing generously, one hopes that tradition continues. The message was clear. Eleanor stood at the center of impossible expectations. If she tried to live up to Margaret's memory, she would be judged against a legend. If she refused, she would be labeled ungrateful. Either choice promised criticism. Before she could respond, Reverend Morrison stepped closer. "Mrs. Caldwell, may I speak with you?" Grateful for the interruption, Eleanor followed him a few paces away. "I wanted to ask about the boys' religious upbringing," he said evenly. "Margaret was deeply involved in that part of their lives." "I read scripture with them in the evenings," Eleanor replied. "That's good to hear," he said. She also organized Sunday lessons for the younger children. "Several ladies were hoping you might continue that work." Eleanor hesitated. "I'm not certain I'm suited for leading something like that." "You were trained as a teacher," the Reverend pressed gently. "Few here are more qualified." Before Eleanor could answer, raised voices erupted near the church steps. Daniel Caldwell stood nose to nose with Billy Henderson, fists clenched. Thomas crossed the yard in long strides and gripped Daniel's shoulder. "What's this about?" Billy blurted out. "He said his new mama only married you for your money." Daniel turned, his face red with fury. "He said she doesn't care about us." The churchyard went silent. Thomas's gaze settled on Billy. "You owe my wife an apology." I only repeated what I heard," the boy muttered, glancing at his mother. "Then," Thomas said, turning slightly toward Mrs. Henderson, "perhaps adults should be more careful with their conversations." The rebuke was quiet but unmistakable. Before anyone could speak, Samuel stepped forward. "She does care," he said, his small voice steady. "She makes us breakfast every day and reads to us and fixes our clothes. She promised she wouldn't leave." The simplicity of the words struck harder than any argument. Daniel joined his brother. "And she teaches us real lessons. And she makes Papa smile, not pretend smiles." Thomas looked down, momentarily stunned. Murmurs spread. Faces softened. Mrs. Wilson spoke up. "Children may be adaptable, but they don't lie about kindness." "Perhaps," Mrs. Murphy added pointedly, "we should be welcoming Mrs. Caldwell instead of testing her." The tension slowly unraveled. On the ride home, Daniel sat straighter, pride flickering in his eyes when he looked at Eleanor. Something between them had shifted, solidified. That night, as dishes dried and the house settled, Eleanor thanked Thomas for standing beside her. "You're my wife," he said simply. "What touches you touches us." Later, Thomas paused. "Do I really smile more?" Eleanor smiled. "When you're not thinking about it." He nodded. "Then maybe that's not such a bad thing." The warmth inside the house held firm, even as trouble began to circle outside. Thomas noticed the missing cattle during his weekly count. 20 had gone. No broken fences. No tracks leading astray. "Wolves," Jake suggested, without conviction. "Wolves don't cut wire," Thomas replied. "And they don't drive cattle toward rail lines." Eleanor overheard the conversation from the kitchen window. A cold unease settled deep in her chest. That evening, the men gathered. "It's not just us," Miguel reported. "Other ranches are missing stock too. Anyone suspicious?" Thomas asked. "A well-dressed stranger asking questions," Jake said. "About land. About manpower. And the railroad," Miguel added. He wanted to know the final route. Thomas exhaled slowly. "Then this isn't theft. It's pressure. Pressure to sell. Pressure to weaken." Eleanor stood alone afterward, hands trembling as she cleaned the supper dishes. She had come seeking shelter. Now even that shelter was being tested, and winter was far from finished. Thomas returned from the eastern pasture before dawn, his expression carved from stone. "They came again," he said. 15 more cattle. And they killed one of my bulls just to prove they could." The cruelty of it made Eleanor's stomach twist. This was no longer theft, it was intimidation. To make matters worse, the violence escalated. 3 days later, Eleanor heard shouting outside and ran to the yard. Jake Morrison was being half-carried toward the house, blood soaking his shirt. A bullet had torn through his shoulder. Without hesitation, Eleanor took command, boiling water, cleaning the wound, steadying Jake through the pain. The men watched in silence as she worked, calm and precise. "These aren't frightened thieves," Jake muttered. "They shot first. No warning." Thomas arrived mid-bandage, fury contained only by discipline. When his eyes met Eleanor's, something changed. He no longer saw her as the woman who kept his house running, but as someone he could rely on when everything fell apart. That night, plans were made. The territorial marshal had been contacted, but help would take time. Until then, they would defend the ranch themselves. "If things turn bad," Thomas said quietly, "you take the boys and hide." "That's not enough," Eleanor replied. "I can shoot. I can help. This is my home too." After a long moment, Thomas nodded. "Then we stand together." 2 nights later, the attack came. Gunfire shattered the quiet. Eleanor moved without panic, waking the boys, guiding them to the root cellar she had prepared days earlier, turning fear into a practiced routine. When footsteps thundered through the house, Eleanor did not hide. She stood in the hallway with Thomas's shotgun raised. The intruders laughed until she fired. One went down screaming. The other froze just long enough for Thomas to appear behind them, weapon drawn. The threat ended there. When it was over, Eleanor's hands shook, but her resolve did not. "They're safe," she told Thomas. "The boys." Something unspoken passed between them then. From that night on, their marriage changed, not by law, but by choice. In the weeks that followed, the territorial marshal arrived. The rustlers were arrested. The operation traced back to a railroad syndicate trying to force landowners to sell. The danger slowly receded. What remained was something new. Thomas sought Eleanor's counsel. She tended wounds, taught children, rebuilt trust. The boys claimed her fully as their mother. And somewhere between shared meals and quiet evenings, affection deepened into love. One night, Thomas finally spoke it aloud. "This marriage was meant to be practical," he said. Somewhere along the way, it became real. Eleanor met his gaze. "It became real for me too." When they kissed, it was no longer obligation, but certainty. Spring arrived early that year. The ranch flourished. Eleanor's small school filled with children from neighboring homesteads. Laughter returned to the house. 6 months after their first, hurried wedding, Thomas did something unexpected. He planned another one. This time, with music, flowers, neighbors, and joy. When Eleanor stepped into the yard and saw the preparations, the wagons, the smiles, the boys beaming with pride, tears filled her eyes. "This time," Thomas said softly, taking her hands, "I'm marrying you because I love you." And Eleanor knew, without doubt, that she had found more than shelter. She had found a family. As the sun set over the Montana plains and lanterns glowed beneath the old oak tree, Eleanor Caldwell understood something she had never known before. Love did not always arrive with promises and passion. Sometimes it came quietly, through shared hardship, earned trust, and the choice to stay. And sometimes, against all odds, it was stronger for it. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and write in the comments from which country you are watching.